For all of you just joining us, we'll get started in just a minute as we fill our virtual room here. And we'll wait just a little bit longer. Looks like there's still some more people coming in. Got a good crowd today. So we'll get started. Hello and welcome. I'd like to thank you for joining us and to thank our distinguished panelists for participating in today's discussion about the future of work and the new reality about working remotely, perhaps as we are demonstrating in a way with this virtual event. I'm David Lesher, the editor of CalMatters. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide news organization with a mission to raise public awareness about the major issues facing California. This event is part of a series this year that we are happy to co-host with the Milken Institute California Center about the future of work. Even before the pandemic, our reporters spread throughout the state were focused on the rapid changes in industry and the growing mismatch between wages and cost of living in a state with the nation's highest rates for poverty and income inequality. Today, facing a triple crisis from the virus and a deep recession and the demand to end systemic racism, our questions about the future of work are even more urgent and essential. I'm especially interested in today's topic about the way we conduct business and the sense that it could change forever in ways that raise important questions about our future work, about the way we live, and about the ways we will address these issues of equity and racism. At CalMatters, we are committed to being a trusted source of information about all of these issues. I encourage you to follow us at calmatters.org, to subscribe to our daily newsletter, and to help support this free source of quality information by making a donation. Now I'm very happy to introduce Matt Horton, our co-host and the director of the Milken Institute's California Center.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Horton, and I'm a director at the Milken Institute's California Center. And for those that don't know, the Milken Institute is also a nonpartisan, nonprofit economic policy think tank. And we're also excited to be partnered with CalMatters to be bringing you this series of conversations as we aim to explore the regional response and recovery and resilience strategies around what the future of work will mean in a post-COVID landscape. And as Dave mentioned, in recognizing that with workers in California and across the country losing their jobs at record-setting numbers, the key to reviving the state's economic success really lies in cultivating a 21st century workforce that facilitates more enhanced access to education and employment opportunities. We think enhancing these access points will involve providing targeted education and training programs, along with strengthened public and private partnerships that promote more equitable growth while supporting employers' critical workforce needs. In this Future of Work series, we'll be bringing together an array of state and local leaders in education, business, and policy to discuss what is needed in ways of system improvements and what strategies are essential to repair existing gaps, bridge access, and scale effective workforce development programs to ensure a more robust and diversified California workforce for the future. So with all that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Lauren Helper, the economy reporter at CalMatters. Thanks, Lauren, and take it away.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us for this conversation. I'm really excited about the panel we have today, representing many different parts of the state to talk about this new world of work that we've all been plunged into with COVID-19. And joining us to discuss are Kome Ajise, the executive director of SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, State Senator Ana Caballero, representing the state's 12th Senate District, and Lily Gangas, the Chief Technology Community Officer at the KPOR Center in Oakland. One quick note, I'll be asking questions for the first 30 to 40 minutes of our conversation, and then we'll switch over to questions from the audience. So you can submit a question anytime using the chat feature in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Just click CalMatters host as the recipient, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. To start things off, everyone, I just want to talk a little bit about where we are now. I mean, where you're sitting in Southern California is at the epicenter of the wave of coronavirus cases that we're seeing now. What are you hearing in terms of how cities and employers are adapting in real time to these extended closures?
Well, thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for joining us. It's a tremendous privilege to be on this panel to talk about these issues that are so at the forefront of our lives today. In terms of what we at SCAG, we represent 191 cities and 6 counties, and so our membership is essentially at the forefront, the front line of dealing with the issues. We've always maintained that local government is the best government, given that they're the closest to the people and to deliver the resources and services that people need. And so all of our members are at the forefront of trying to figure out how to deal with COVID-19. I think essentially the health and safety of the population is primary in all of our jurisdictions considerations. So whether it's taking care of the public health issues of making testing available, making sure that employers have access to opportunities for keeping employees on their jobs. Those are the things that cities are spending their resources on. And so it's very important as we talk about this that the most devastated level of government at this point is actually cities and counties, because they're really strapped for resources. First of all, with the economy put on hold, they depend on those sales tax to provide the services that they do provide. So just looking for resources from all sources, whether it's federal, state, and private sector, I think is one of the things you see our cities going for. But primarily is just to watch out for the healthcare of the population within their jurisdictions, providing testing, providing healthcare services. We still have the issue of homelessness that many of them are grappling with that hasn't gone away. That's become exacerbated in this process. Social services demands have gone up. And so taking care of providing for the social services issues that used to be there and continue to be there and actually more aggravated now, I think it's the other. I think finally, the issue of providing for businesses to allow for businesses to be open, I think is the other big issue that cities have to grapple with. How do you reopen and still maintain adequate health vigilance? I think is one of the toughest things cities have to deal with. And so we're seeing some reaction to that on catering to businesses so they can open and provide not only employment, but also revenues, for that matter, for those cities.
And switching gears to the state level, Senator Caballero, how are you and your fellow lawmakers thinking about sort of what comes next in the state's response to the pandemic now that we're seeing some of these divides around online education, unemployment, disproportionately Latino and Black essential workers getting sick? Where do we go from here?
Well, first, let me thank you very much for doing this conversation. I think it's really important to have an opportunity to talk about what's going on in our state and what are some of the looking at the crystal ball, trying to figure out where we go next. You're absolutely correct. This pandemic has knocked us off our axis, so to speak. And what started off as a very robust economy has quickly devolved into one of the worst recessions that the state has ever seen. So you see revenues coming into the state as well as local government, as was mentioned, way down. But having said that, the way the Senate has been looking at it, and I can speak on behalf of the Senate, we have been sheltering in place since mid-March, and other than doing the budget, we really haven't taken up anything else. And we focused on 5 crises that the state is facing all at the same time. It's the COVID-19, wildfire season is coming. We have a homelessness crisis and a housing crisis, both that are different, but all happening at the same time. And we have individuals that are unable to purchase insurance for their homes and their businesses in some of our mountainous communities because of the threat of wildfire. So if you can't purchase insurance, you can't maintain your mortgage, is what it amounts to. So we're trying, and then in addition to that, we're all very sensitive to the civil justice issues that that we need to deal with in this state. So that's the framework we've been operating under, and our budget really reflects that we're putting our money where our mouth is. We've put resources for homelessness and housing. We've funded education, despite the fact that we're in the middle of the recession. And we're looking at economic stimulus. In other words, how can we get people back to work? Given that many people may not have a job to go back to, what are the kinds of infrastructure improvements that we could focus on that would put people back to work immediately? So, and in addition to that, we're covering the medical needs of everybody that needs a test and that may end up hospitalized because of the COVID-19. So those have been our focuses, and it's difficult because what the bills that we started in January and February are not the bills that we're working on now, and those we've pushed to the side. We've drastically in the Senate reduced the number of bills that we're working on, and they have to have some relationship to these issues in order to move forward.
And I mean, to your point about sort of the workforce and getting people back to work, Lily, you're really immersed in the state's tech ecosystem, which a lot of people point to as potentially kind of a bright spot in all of this, with the rise of remote jobs that tend to pay better salaries. But what do you think the first several months of this kind of unexpected shift have taught us about how likely it is or how wise it is for remote work to really be the long-term future?
Sure. I think just to reflect back on where we're at now in July and looking back in March, thinking that it was going to be a few weeks and then it became a month, and then now it's going to really be the rest of the year. And I think one of the parts that's really important to note is that the remote workforce has already been increasing. It's been a trend that's been happening for a while. And when Square and Twitter and Facebook all are announcing that they're going to provide more remote work, and Square and Twitter actually going even further, saying that they're going to make sure that even if the office is open, everybody can still be able to choose to continue to work remotely. And so for a lot of folks, that was like, what's happening? But in reality, according to, there was a data that was released from Flex Jobs that actually just shows that within the last 5 years, 44% growth in remote jobs. The last 10 years, 91%. The last 12 years, 159%. So this has been a trend that has been happening, that's been accelerated because of technology. And also some of the issues I brought up earlier, cost of living, the benefits, schools, many different issues. And I think that what's really bringing to bear is that for some people, the remote work provides an opportunity to rethink a lot of areas. But I think it's also really important to think about what does it really mean? There's a lot of different models, such as like distributed workforce, where you have the teams across, or you're at home and you're doing the same work and you're able to do it from home, or you're able to do virtual jobs in a virtual environment, or you're able to be an agile workforce where you can add the teams as needed. So it's really an important time for us to also just stop and rethink and reflect on, what are we building? What are we running to so fast, and for who? What are the benefits? What are the trade-offs that we had to make in order to be adapting into this speed, right? But also ultimately, what is the leadership? What are we actually building towards as a community, and what are the externalities that it has? And I think it's really important in this area to also just be aware that a lot of people don't have the option to work from home. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Black and Hispanic workers were much less likely to be able to have that option. And as we've seen, the ones that didn't have that option have lost their jobs, as we've seen the numbers go in historic unemployment rates, specifically impacting a lot of people of color. And so we have to make sure that those intersectionalities are explicitly called out. So then that way we know how to better approach the problem. And the folks that had jobs became a lot of essential workers. And again, if you take a look at who it's impacting and whether they even have that option, specifically Latinx community become the most vulnerable in the workforce. There was a data that was shared by Brookings that show that out of the total 6 million workers in LA, about 25% or 1.1 are vulnerable workers. And that means that they're getting paid less than the median wage. They're not receiving employer-sponsored healthcare. And they're most likely to continue to be laid off or reduced hours, right? And these are in the sectors such as hospitality, healthcare, and retail. And as we've seen, those fields will not come back. And so when we want to make sure that we are having a comprehensive look of what is the California economy entail. And yes, it is driven a lot by tech, but all these other sectors have a tech lens as well that can be better utilized and put forth into how do we recover for this. So all that to say that there's a huge opportunity for digital upskilling. And it's really important to understand that it's extremely challenging to even get a job if you don't have computer or broadband access. Given that 70% of the jobs now are only found online, how are you even supposed to get a job, right? If you don't have some of the basics. And so I think that it's incredibly important that we pause, reflect, and yes, see those bright spots, but it's also an opportunity to rethink the whole system and making sure that we are really designing for the most vulnerable, because we need them to be digitally connected. And so I think that this is really a critical time for both private sector and public sector to come together in a way that we haven't done before.
Yeah, and I have more specific questions on the digital divide, but one thing I also want to talk about is sort of just starting with our physical environments, what cities and towns might look like after this kind of collective shock that we've all experienced. And so, Kome, one question I had for you was how cities are approaching this question of how many businesses are going to go back to brick and mortar offices versus permanently keeping workers remote. Are you aware of cities actually starting to plan for that type of thing, or where are we in that process?
Well, I think, good question though. I think cities are already taking some steps to react to the various stages of reopening, because some of those are really conditioned on what businesses are allowed to open. So as cities react to those, we're seeing some, I'm not sure how much of that's going to be permanent, but we're seeing some quick reaction because, again, like I said earlier on, there's this need to get people back to work. There's a need to continue to gin up the economy. And so we're seeing things like cities shutting down streets to provide more outdoor dining. I think there's a new phrase for that. It's called streeteries, which is, I think, very genius that somebody came up with that. But we're seeing more streeteries across the state, and especially across Southern California. And that makes sense, because then you have some more room to have potential social distancing in dining, and because people really want to get out and see other people. So that's a very important move. I think the community members are also doing things on their own where they're seeing less traffic and taking advantage of it. I don't know how many of you have seen families go on bike rides these days, but we're seeing more and more of those where people feel comfortable to have their kids ride with them in the evening. And so we're seeing cities then maybe more formalizing that into what we call slow streets, where streets are beginning to look more attractive to pedestrian and bicyclists. So these are some really key trends that we're seeing out there with cities.
On both of those,
informal, some are more formal.
Yeah, on both of those examples, just because I think there's a lot of interest in things like the streeteries and like these streets being more open for bikes and for pedestrians. Is it clear, are cities right now codifying those to be sort of things that will stick around after we're out of this kind of shelter in place limbo, or is that to be determined?
I think on some level, both. There are some that might be maybe temporary. There might be experiments for now as we see lower traffic volumes. But in fact, there are some that cities have already decided. Prior to the pandemic, there has been, at least in the planning world, some discussion about making some streets 100% pedestrian access only. And so there has been some reticence in doing that because it's like, where is traffic going to go? And so this pandemic shutdown actually provides an opportunity to be more bold in making those decisions in some of our communities. And so we've seen some cities take down streets, make them just pedestrian access only, pedestrian and bike access only. And so we'll see some of those become more permanent, more so than maybe if we didn't have the pandemic.
Yeah, definitely. And then Lily, when we think about kind of the geography of jobs and of opportunity in the state, we know that tech hiring in the past has tended, you mentioned that remote work and things have been like disaggregating this a little bit, but tech hiring does still tend to be pretty concentrated in hubs like the Bay Area. So do you see this moment as a sort of push factor for companies to spread those opportunities out, or what might it take for that to happen?
Yes. We are in a new wave of not only identifying talent, but reskilling and upskilling it, that I think all companies should pause and really reflect and see where they're at. This isn't business as normal, and it's not going to be. This is a new wave, and we all need to really rethink the way we've done things in the past. So just to give you an example from specifically around how some of the talent gets sourced here in the Bay, and why it's been so specifically concentrated in the Bay Area. And it really comes back to recruiting, to be honest. It's simple. It's basically taking a look at where are these top universities, how do we recruit that talent and get them into these tech jobs. There's like a formula to some degree, but as we know, that's also come with a lot of bias, and it also leaves a lot of a lot of the talent out of the marketplace, right? And I think that especially with COVID, there is an opportunity here that's different. And Professor Galloway at NYU Stern has actually been ringing the alarms of the disruption of higher education, right? And so that's where most of the new talent workforce was being recruited into some of these tech jobs that tend to be more around specific area. Now with all the secondary education and university education taking place online, I think that a lot of the students and the talent are going to start to question whether those big price tags, and we've seen the $1 trillion debt that a lot of the students have been going on for years, is that going to stay the same? Is the product that they were getting in the same, at a higher cost every year, but in a format that they can get anywhere, is that going to still be something that the talent will want, that the market needs? And I think at the end of the day, I think that there's going to be a big trend where we're going to start to see the MIT at Googles, the Harvard by Facebooks and whatnot. However, I think that the problem with that is that it's actually going to continue to widen the gap of who gets jobs, who gets the emerging tech jobs, the better paying jobs, right? And so I think it's something that we have to be very, very critical at, and really start to rethink how we are designing those programs. And if the data, if we allow it to continue to go the way it's been, there was Wired, for example, a few months ago published the data from the Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft over from 2014 to 2018 of how much they've increased in the representation of people of color, specifically Black, Latinx, and Native. No surprise, it hasn't moved much, right? Because they're still doing it the same old way. And I think that this part now where we're in, it really allows us the opportunity to look at new models and look at the way we are actually identifying market relevant jobs. Specifically COVID, there's two sectors such as education and healthcare that provide an opportunity for new innovations, maybe new jobs to be created. But the current systems are not going to train us to those parts, right? So this is where alternatives are going to have to come in. In 2019, the Department of Labor had about $280+ million in funding for apprenticeship programs, as an example, to spur more jobs and get faster talent into jobs that are needed and that the market is demanding. And then now with COVID, we should be thinking in the trillions, because as we're a digital first, there's a way bigger gap to close in the digital skilling. And I think that that's going to be really critical. Just to put some examples for folks of what this really entails, there's a Caper Capital company called Bidwise that's based out in Fresno, and they've been really leading the charge in this type of dialogue of finding alternatives, specifically bringing opportunities to underdog cities, to cities that tend to get overlooked because they're not in the Bay, they're in different areas that some of these tech companies traditionally don't look at, right? But they've also gone a further step to create opportunities in joining larger collectives. So that's a trend that we're starting to see. So for example, skillup.org is a coalition bringing more than 12 different organizations together to specifically help the 40 million workers impacted by COVID to get rehired in in-demand jobs in high growth industries. And I think that formula, that focus is going to be critical for us to move, to create more inclusive ecosystems, given where we're at now. And so there's also the Onward California and Onward USA that has been creating new ways and new jobs. and new ways to identify those opportunities. And so I think we have to really relook at how are we assessing talent? How are we creating pathways to non-traditional occupations and new occupations that are going to be coming? And then also the financing models. I don't think we've talked about that, where a lot of that has always had to be on the talent that's trying to get the opportunities. I think we really need to relook at that and look at how to make credentials more flexible, bring in more corporate training, and just be really creative. But I'm going to go back to the foundation that I brought up in the first question, is that without closing the fundamentals of broadband access, divide access, basic digital, all this stuff, it's not going to work for the majority of our population. And if anything we've learned, it requires all of us to be in the table. This is the moment to just rethink. And so I think that that's the silver lining that keeps me excited, as you can tell from my from all my thinking and position on this.
Yeah, definitely. A ton happening on workforce development for sure. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, Senator Caballero, is sort of what the housing side of this potentially means. So one thing we're seeing in expensive cities like San Francisco are rents starting to drop. And you've got these anecdotal reports about high earning people leaving for Oregon or Colorado or whatever lower cost scenic place. I'm curious about whether there are areas in your district where people are vying for transplants, looking for that kind of lifestyle change. And what does that mean for people who already live there and the need for kind of proactive investment or policies?
That's a really good question. I live in Salinas, and Salinas has been tremendously impacted by workers in the Silicon Valley moving into a rural agricultural community and earning much more than what the workers that work in the agricultural industry or the tourism industry, which are both part of our county. But even in areas like in Merced and in Stanislaus County, people are buying homes in Los Banos and Patterson and Newman, and their commutes, they're super commuters. Their commutes are an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on what time of the day they leave. And they're not easy commutes. They're going over passes that are dangerous and that see a lot of traffic. And so what's very interesting is what's difficult from my experience is that these super commuters don't really have an opportunity to contribute to the social and cultural life of the community because they're spending so much time on the road. So they don't join the Rotary clubs, they don't make contributions to the local schools and those kinds of things. And this opportunity to work from home now is giving people an opportunity to reflect on how much time they're not spending on the road and to be really productive for the company nonetheless. And mention was made about the companies that are moving towards this virtual workplace, working at home rather than coming into the office. And so I'm kind of excited about it because it means that they can now, these individuals can now be a part, they can make their purchases in the communities they live in rather than at where they work. But my concern is this. So I'm interested in land use issues and what's going to change and what's different. Let me just say that California has between 1.5 and 3 million, we're behind 3 million housing units, 1.5 to 3 million, depending on which study you look at. So that if we could tomorrow build 1.5 million units, they'd be filled immediately because people are living in overcrowded situations in people's garages, they're couch surfing, they want their own place. And so we have this real need to look at land use and look at it differently. And maybe some of the policies at the state level have to change as well. We've been incentivizing infill development along major transportation corridors. And that's a good thing, but we haven't seen it happen fast enough. And maybe we don't need to do that as much. Maybe what we need to do is to figure out how to create incentives for more people to work, not have to go into an office to work, because then our transportation system is not overburdened. So that's one frame, is we've been looking at how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a land use that may be becoming obsolete. But if they can move out to the Central Valley, maybe they can move out to other states. And so we need to be careful, because we may be accelerating that development, so that people can live anywhere they want and still work for the companies that have been the economic engine of California. And that would be a huge loss for the state of California, because there's a synergy that's created with all these companies being located in the same area and sharing the same talent pool and competing against each other. But let me also just say that my concern is also in making sure we're doing infill development. And so I've really focused on utilizing parcels that no longer are going to function well. What we've seen is the acceleration of people buying online, not going into a physical store. And so you've seen or heard Sears, Kmart, Toys R Us, Macy's, they've all said they're either going to downsize or they're in bankruptcy. And when those stores close, we have a lot of commercial space that we're not going to be using anymore. And right now, there are strip malls that are performing very, very poorly because their major tenant is no longer there. So I'm looking for the opportunity, and I have a bill this year that would provide an opportunity to do some conversions to create villages. So you have housing that's co-located with commercial, and to do that in an expedited basis, make it easier to do that. But we're going to have to rethink this. We're going to have to sit down and say, how is our society changing so that we can offer the kinds of housing and transportation infrastructure for the future, not just for what we need right now. And I want to second what's been said about broadband. It's we're in a crisis. I've been talking with school districts, with the superintendents, also school board members and parents, and the numbers are astounding. The number of individuals that don't have broadband access in my district. Moving to an all online academic year is devastating. Many students, hundreds of thousands. And right now what they're doing in order to access the internet is they're showing up in parks and in Starbucks trying to get internet to be able to do some of the work that they need to do.
I mean, how do you think about that? Just given that in the past week, we've seen this wave of announcements about how many schools are going to continue to be online in the fall. What are some of the immediate and longer term things you're advocating for when it comes to that digital divide?
So I'm working with Senator Gonzalez from Long Beach, and she's got a bill, SB 1130, I believe is the number. And it's a work in progress, but right now, the challenge we have is that we have a fund that has been created. Everybody who has an internet device pays a small fee on that device, and it goes into an access fund that does not link up well with the federal government, so that you can't draw down federal funds if you're doing a project that uses this fund. And so they're at odds with each other. We need to line up our program with the feds. They have a lot more money than we do. We need to change the right of first refusal. Right now, any money that gets spent, well, actually, to put it a different way, if there is a need for internet service in a community and they ask for it, one of the big tech companies can say, we're moving in and we'll provide service, but there's no requirement that they be given a date. And so that effectively freezes out many communities from getting internet service, because in reality, those residents, there's either not a large number in order to support the service, or they're poor and disadvantaged. And so they can't pay a lot of money for the service. And so there's no interest really in providing those services, but there's that right of first refusal. So there are a number of things we're working on to make sure that we have the fund in good shape, can pull down federal dollars, can change the right of a first refusal, make sure that they have fast speeds. Right now, some communities have internet, but the speed is terrible. You can't do telehealth and online education. And then we need to make sure that that we're prioritizing disadvantaged communities.
Mm-hmm.
So we're
And
working on all of that and trying to get it through this legislative session.
right, so a lot happening there, and we're starting to get a lot of really good questions about this issue, so keep them coming. We'll switch over to those in just a minute. Kome, I wanted to ask you, after the senator brought up this issue of super commutes, I know that SCAG does a lot of work on this issue of transportation, and specifically you have a planning effort underway called Connect SoCal. I'm wondering what that's like at this moment when people are starting to rethink how many people will be doing these commutes. Again, this question of remote work, where does that stand?
Oh, excellent question. I think this is really, it's all aligning. We had been looking at telework ahead of the COVID-19 hit, because we'd seen trends over the last few years that, in fact, more and more people are choosing to work from home, and it was becoming the fastest growing mode choice, a single mode choice before COVID-19 hit. Now, what we had assumed would happen over time, it is really marginal compared to what we've seen with the shutdown and the amount of people that are now teleworking. And so we expect that trend to mostly accelerate. We have what we call a transportation demand management strategic plan that we had worked on that was looking at exactly that, how we could encourage employers to allow more people to work from home, get more facilities or co-working environments created in parts of our region, such that people would not have to be super commuters. So these are things that we had looked at in Connect SoCal. Connect SoCal is our regional transportation plan that looks out 25 years to 2045 and begins to look at trends and how our region could grow and continue to be livable and economically vibrant at the same time. And so in that structure of that plan, we had looked at the TDM as an opportunity to reduce the telecommute, the super commuters, and increase telework. I want to touch on the broadband aspect because that's something we also had spent some time thinking about, and we in fact are working with the California Emerging Technologies Fund, which was created to do exactly that, deal with the digital divide, and the Inland Empire Coalition on Broadband to study this notion of the digital divide in an area that has a depressed economy and a lot of disadvantaged communities. And so trying to bridge that, we have a study that will begin shortly that looks at how we ratchet up broadband access to communities out there. With COVID-19, I think one of the things that's become apparent to us is, especially asking students to stay home and work and go to school, asking us to access our healthcare remotely, and also having people work from home. Having broadband is not just a nice to have anymore; it becomes an imperative. It becomes almost a habitability issue for all of our homes now. No different than having electricity, basically, is what it's beginning to look like. And especially when we start to talk about social equity, it's important then to keep that in focus. So we're working through, there's a coalition of folks that are working at the high level in Southern California that's looking at this digital divide in a very strategic way, looking to see how we might realign resources that would normally have gone to health or education that could now be redirected to funding broadband. So this is in focus. There's a lot of work that's going on in there, and I'm really glad to have that conversation.
Yeah, and on that point, we just got a question from the audience, Lily. They said, you spoke about the need to design digital systems for the most vulnerable, and we're wondering about some details for that. I was also hoping, could you share a little bit about how you first got into tech and maybe what that says about how these paths to opportunity look? And again, these questions about how you turn that into kind of like a systemic reform effort.
Definitely. Thank you so much for the questions. And I think that as we also are experiencing, even when the sound comes in and out, it's really some of the limitations of our current broadband across, right? And so To start with my story, I think we gotta bring it back home and like really go back to the individuals, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to help create a better community. Gotta really start with the people that we're trying to service and not forget about them. And so for me, I have the stats that we talk about that are always against us. That was my case, right? Of being an immigrant, single parent, had to learn English. Math was my language. I was very fortunate that I had teachers who early on saw and believed in me, and like they were able to put me in the right paths and help me discover that engineering could be a pathway for me. And so fast forward to going and being like the first person in my family to be an engineer, and then with my first job right out of undergrad, I getting into a job that helped me get 3 times what my mom was making, with her working 2 times, right? And so technology really changed my life in being able to help me provide an upward economic mobility opportunity, right? But that my experience in itself to where I'm at now, as I've learned, it cannot be by somebody tapping me and somebody seeing me. We have to be so much more intentional because we're leaving so much of our students behind. And as the data that was shared earlier from Senator Caballero, this is a huge problem. The digital divide right now is a critical issue. And the part that to me, as I reflect back in my journey, back when I was at USC, this is like almost 20 years ago, we were still talking about this issue. I remember going and volunteering, and at least back then USC had Wi-Fi for the local community. So we were able to do it then. Why can we do it now? I was already taking online classes, learning electrical engineering online. So if we were able to do that back then, where are we now? And so I think that there's a lot of, we just have to be really honest and look at how we become complacent, or what are the monopolies, but also how are we not redesigning and rethinking? And I think thinking of who right now, this generation, specifically this youth, is intersectional. It is creative. They want to have culturally relevant content in how they're learning, how they're accessing, but there's still a lot of key issues that are not being addressed for them, right? And this is the part where the public and the private, I hope that if there's anything that comes out of 2020 is that we finally close this digital divide. And for me, the digital divide it's both digital disconnection, but also digital adoption. So then that way, folks like that are in my shoes, they don't have to rely on the chance or some of a donation or something like that to help them get going. And just to briefly just share the magnitude of the problem for some of the folks who may not be aware, I highly recommend to check out Common Sensus and BCG's new report that did a study across the US as well as state by state. And across, it's showing that 30% of our K-12 students are living in households with no internet connection, no adequate devices to even be able to learn, right? And if we take a look at across all the 50 states, when we see who's the most impacted, Black, Latinx, and Native households, with Blacks being the 30% and Latinas like 26% and Native Americans 35%. So we're just talking about some huge discrepancies around the racial, economic, as well as the digital divide. But it's not also just the students, it's also the teachers. And this is the part that when we think about the whole experience, right, of my journey and who helped me, if that teacher didn't have some of the resources, the professional development opportunities, but also just some of the basics of having broadband and devices themselves, how would they have helped me learn, right? And so I think that that's something that we have to be very mindful, because as the data and the report showed that for every one teacher disconnected, that's 16 times the effect that it has based on the student to teacher ratio. And so we have to really be looking at that. And I think one of the parts that I wanted to also just bring up from my experience, and I think where we're at in this state, is I just want to really give a big shout out to the community colleges, the libraries, the community-based organizations that despite in this time in COVID, they've been mobilizing as fast as they can and making sure that they're really meeting the community where they're at. And so we need to also look at it as a comprehensive ecosystem and support each other, because it's also not just the students, not just the teachers, it's the parents who are also a part of the labor market force, right? So many of these parents themselves don't have the jobs. And if we go a little bit even further, to our small businesses and brick mortars, they've also been totally left out. Specifically here in Oakland, when just starting to take a look at some of the businesses that rapidly had to rethink a digital strategy, even though they never had to, now they got caught in between, and we're expecting about 50% of these local businesses to close within the next 2-3 months, right? And what is that going to do with the overall economics of the community? And it impacts everybody. And so I do think that it is time for comprehensive local, state, and federal strategy for us to tackle this huge problem. And it has to be this year, because if it doesn't happen with the pandemic, the largest social rights movement, and what we're starting to see now with how long it's going to last, when is it going to happen? And so I want to just put to awareness that there's bills on the line at the state level and federal level. The SB 1130 that was covered earlier, that it's also very critical that it raises the standards, so then that way everybody can have the same speed everywhere. There's also the federal level, the Congress, the House passed the HR, which really looks at $1 trillion of investments, and that's really what we need to start talking about at that level across the U.S. And then right now it's in the Senate, right? So we have to start to take a look at what's happening with the other bill, which is HR 2, the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act. And so I think this is beyond one person's experience, is beyond just education. We're talking about workforce, and then we're also talking about the overall small business and overall economic outlook. And so I just wanted to bring those to awareness, because it is critical. And especially for me as an immigrant, I also want to make sure that we are not forgetting about the undocumented families. I have stories here from Fruitville, here in Oakland, where some of the kids that look like me, right, that they had the same path, their parents are too afraid to get online using the Comcast Essentials because it requires their driver's license. On paper, they're checked off as connected. In reality, they're not. And so what are they doing? They're going to their aunts, cousins' houses, and also even being more exposed to the COVID. So how are we ever going to get out of this? We have to stay ahead. And so I just want to summarize it back and it's an integrated strategy, local, state, and federal, like we've never seen it before.
Mm-hmm. And we are getting a lot of questions about this conversation on the digital divide and kind of the nuts and bolts of what it looks like to close some of these access divides. And one question for you, Senator Caballero, or others, feel free to jump in, came from Kevin. And he said that in the past, bandwidth requirements for rural areas to be considered underserved have been extremely low, which makes it difficult for them to be considered for funding from the state. And so he asks, especially in communities where the market isn't dense enough to attract private investment and competition for broadband infrastructure, what can be done to ensure that public funding results in networks that encourage competition and give better service at lower costs, being the kind of the end game?
Well, there are a bunch of different issues in that particular question. Let me see if I can hit them all. Number one is on a theory that any internet service is better than none. The way that our internet distribution has worked is that it was better to build something that was inadequate than to have nothing. And that's one of the reasons that Senator Gonzalez and I are working so hard on 1130 is that we disagree. We fundamentally disagree, because then you can build an inferior service and say, okay, we're done. All right. They'll be happy. And it is unequal. And that's not what is in the best interest of all Californians. So number one is that we believe that it should be the highest level of service, period, for the entire state. But then that then raises the issue of who pays for it. How does it get paid for? And practically speaking, who's providing the service in that area at a reasonable cost? And I think people have agreed that $10 to $12 is kind of a month is something that is reasonable. So that's part of the reason that what we need to do is to be able to access the federal funds that are available to help us do this system. And it's going to have to be a public-private partnership with some and a commitment that internet service will be treated just like we treat electrification. If you have a need for electricity, then you should be able to hook into a line and it should be available in there for you. So we've got to figure out how to get there. Let me just say that there have been some innovative strategies that that have started to do some work where there's been a vacuum. The community college in Coalinga, West Hills Community College, basically has the only internet service that is there with it for the community college. And they've been able to incentivize a bunch of smaller internet companies that have their equipment is basically kept together with baby wire and gum, and they're providing services at a really reasonable rate, but on a very, very small scale. So the question becomes, is that where we want to put some of the investment in so that there's some competition amongst the internet companies? It's not just the big guys. But the community of Gonzales has worked out an agreement with T-Mobile, and they entered into a contract where they bought all the hotspots and the school district bought all the computers for the homes. And so they now have internet access for every single resident in the city of Gonzales in the Salinas Valley. But that's $300,000 out of their city budget every year. And they can do it because they're a small enough community and they're isolated from any other community. So there's not the economies of scale with a very dense community. And so there's some things that are happening in this sphere, but and as I've talked to the school districts, many of them have made their buses hotspots, and then they've dispersed their buses around their school district property so that residents can use the hotspots. That's a good, short-term solution. It hurts my heart that we have to do that, quite frankly, because in this state that is so tech advanced, but at least they have that technology available for them right now. And that's, we need to look at the now and then the long term, build out the system. And we're going to have to make it a number one priority. I agree with Lily. If we don't do it now, we're never going to do it. We'll do it in bits and pieces that are really not adequate. And in some of my districts, they tell me that up to 90% of the families don't have internet access. That's the magnitude of the problem. And so when you tell them you will move on to online education, to say nothing about whether the teachers have been trained on online education, that's a whole other issue. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So I think we're going to have to be really innovative about how we do things.
We've gotten a couple questions also kind of extending that idea. Some people are asking, does it make sense to define internet as a human right? Does it make sense to officially declare it public utility? Like, do those designations, are those important in this context?
Yeah, I've been asked that question before. The quick answer is that maybe. I would need to look at, our utilities are, for the most part, are privately owned. That doesn't mean they've been good or they've operated well, but if there's historical reasons how some of them are private and some of them are public. It's not enough just to say, well, there's a human right. You've got to figure out who pays, how does it get distributed, and when you do that, let me give you an example. When we started dealing with the whole issue of water, there were a lot of people saying we should tax it. We should just put a tax on water. We've never taxed something that is essential to life. And so if we're going to make it a public utility or a public obligation, then the money's got to come from somewhere. And that's probably a tax. And the problem with our taxing system is usually it's regressive. It means that we're taxing people who can't afford to be taxed anymore. So I'd like to think that there's a way for us to get there and incentivize and set up the infrastructure in a way that provides an incentive for small companies to get in the market and to be able to build up the system as well. But I need to think about what it means to make it a utility. Because with that comes a whole regulatory structure that I'm not sure we need right now. I just need to think about it a little bit. But they're great questions. I've written them down and I'm taking them back so that we can do some research.
Oh, great. Yeah, it's a complicated issue for sure. Yeah, Lily, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think we definitely need something in the short term, is like in an all hands approach of this is the current crisis that we have. And I also want to acknowledge that it's not just for the young, it's also for the older population who are being displaced. This is a public and health issue. It's economic issue, it's a civil rights issue, because the way that the services have avoided certain zip codes, it's not by accident, it has been designed. And if you take a look at the speed, income, and demographic, it's so clear. We should all be ringing the alarms, as this has been one of the biggest ethical issues of our generations. And this year, there's specifically additional funding opportunities in the longer term, because we know that this is going to take time, right? Even if all this money gets passed, okay, so what do we do now? We have to be so critical in making sure that it doesn't get wasted, that it doesn't get done in a bunch of Band-Aids. And so what is a long-term strategy? But this year specific, I just want to raise awareness of Proposition 15. If we start to rethink of like, what is our schools and families, and how do we reinvest and actually close the tax loopholes on some of these large companies, right? Where we can able to bring $12 billion every year to our schools, and rethink the school experience with that, because I think that that's an opportunity to improve the infrastructure. And if we do it by schools, we do it by community colleges, we do it by libraries, we'll be able to eventually get to the entire communities. And if we think of it as the cities as a unit of change, I think we have an opportunity here. But we just have to be as also practical, because kids are starting in like 2-3 weeks. Their parents, whoever is also the caretakers, I think it is a critical issue. And I would love to, whoever is listening to this, we need some data scientists and we need more techies to come in here and help us rethink some of these models, because I think this is a huge opportunity as well for new innovations, new models. And so I encourage those folks that are here that are learning about these stuff to get passionate and join us in finding new solutions.
Yeah. And I mean, I think just this whole issue of rethinking sort of regulatory structures that have been there for a long time, Comey, we're getting a lot of questions about sort of what this means for cities as you're thinking about potential population shifts, where people are maybe going to be living after all of this. And one question in particular was, do you think that cities will begin to shift their regulatory environment, i.e. thinking on zoning, CEQA, all these things that have been kind of big immovable obstacles in the past?
Oh, excellent question. I think, I say yes to everything that's been said by both Lily and the Senator, because I think these are all cogent points, and probably one of the issues of our time. I think this requires, and I say this, and it's maybe a little bit self-serving, this requires some different kind of strategic planning than we've done before. We've always, in our line of work, we were always thinking about broadband as a commute aid. In other words, what do we do to reduce commute and to reduce greenhouse gases? That's been one way to think about it. From what you've heard so far in this conversation, it's way more than that. It's about life itself as we live life itself, whether it's education, health, or just being able to have access to the things that everybody should have access to. So talking about standards, I think that's important. We've always felt like, cities, like I said, are the best form of government because they can serve their population very, very, very directly. However, there are some issues that are just bigger than any single jurisdiction. And so that's why you have the state government get involved. And some of this have to be taken at a regional level, where cities come together and think about this. Think about how your roads are built, for example. Most people don't know the edge of their jurisdiction when they get on the road. And the roads flow from one city to the next. And there are standards for how roads are built and for how you can access them, such that everybody hopefully you have the same experience all the way through. I think we have to think of broadband as that kind of infrastructure that has to be at the same level of, I don't know if you want to call it a utility or not. I think that's a whole different level of legal conversation that need to be had. But I think just the elements of what it means to people's lives make it such that we have to have a basic standard. We have to treat it like an essential infrastructure. And we have to think about how we fund it on a regular basis, such that the funding is not in starts and stops, basically. It's got to be such that this thing is funded and we could see a progression of how we build out the capacity for all people to have access to it. I think it borders on a right if you're going to demand that our students stay home and learn, and yet the avenue for learning is then denied of some of them, not because of their fault, I think that then makes it an imperative for society to look at. And so we're working on, like I said, the planning we're working on in the Inland Empire is going to be helpful in instituting that. The conversation we're having at a larger level in the entire Southern California, all 7 counties, including San Diego, besides just the 6 counties in the SCAG region, is looking at how do we reinvent our region. And broadband is one of the big topics that we're dealing with, and we will be having further conversations on. So yeah, I think the questions are really valid and timely, and this conversation is really timely. And I the one thing that I think we probably should not look too far off from is bring in the people that are affected into the conversation. Oftentimes we get together and we talk amongst ourselves. One of the things that we're doing at SCAG is to reach out through community-based organizations to get at populations that don't typically participate in these conversations. Sometimes we think we know what the needs are, but then Lily just gave you an example of a particular need where some families don't feel comfortable signing on to what they already have. How do we solve for that? But if you don't know those qualities of constraints and challenges that people are dealing with, it's really hard to plan for it. So I think we need to broaden the conversation and bring more people into the conversation. And I'm hoping that the call for collaboration that my board, the SCAG board, approved at the last board meeting will go to some extent to open the pathways for having more voices at the table.
Yeah. All right. So this is good. We've got lots of questions and calls out for people to jump in and provide answers. So thank you all for listening in and asking your questions. I know we've got a lot more and we'll continue to answer them in future stories. If you joined us later in the conversation or would like to watch this discussion again, we will be sending you an email with a link to the full recording. We want to thank our panelists, Lily, Senator Caballero, and Come for joining us today, and the Milken Institute for co-hosting this event with CalMatters. To the audience listening and watching, head over to www.calmatters.org to read the latest journalism about California politics and policy. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.